Joe Wild was appointed as the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Treaties and Aboriginal Government of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, effective May of 2014. So we welcome you to the West Coast, Joe, and invite you to make your presentation. Thank you.
I just want to begin by thanking the Coast Salish people for hosting us today on their land. I also want to thank the Elder for the warm welcome at the beginning of the session. It's pretty nerve-wracking to have to come up after those very elegant speakers that spoke before. The eloquence of their words, pretty inspirational, and I'm also aware that I'm standing between everybody and lunch, so I will do my best to try to get through this in a timely way. I do want to thank the British Columbia Treaty Commission for the invitation to speak today. This is my first time getting to kind of address a room of this size on the importance of the treaty process in British Columbia. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about what is going on in terms of Canada's agenda, specifically around reconciliation and advancing nation-to-nation relationships. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we see as some of the socioeconomic benefits coming out of treaty and self-government agreements. And I'll talk a little bit also about moving forward on nation rebuilding. But I do want to say at the outset that I do this with a lot of humility in that I don't think I have any answers for anyone in this room about how to rebuild nations. You folks know what you want to do, and you know what you want to do in your communities, and I'm not here to suggest that there is anything from kind of Canada's perspective that we think is the right way to do it or to impose any kind of solutions on anyone. We want to enable, we want to help, and we want to have a better dialogue and a better relationship moving forward. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the fact that, we have a changing government. We have a new agenda with this government. And the Prime Minister has taken the unprecedented step of making public every single mandate letter of every single minister. And mandate letters are really important things at the federal level. They basically tell ministers what their priorities are going to be, what they want, what they're going to have to focus on, and that then in turn directs us as public servants about the work that we're going to be doing over the mandate of a government and where the areas of focus will be. And in every single minister's letter, the Prime Minister stated that no relationship is more important to him and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. And in that letter, he said, it is time for a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. Those words are meant to inspire, they're eloquent, some would say they're poetry, and what the real trick is how do we translate those words into concrete actions in both terms of how we behave as government officials and the approaches that we take through the policies that we put in place as we work our way through the treaty and self-government negotiation processes. What's underlying those words and why the Prime Minister talks about the relationship being not only important to himself but to Canada is because ultimately how we move forward with reconciliation, how we take ownership of the shared history that was referred to, how we take ownership of the impacts and the harms that have been caused by past government policies and actions, to the extent to which the kind of tendrils of those colonialized-based policies still reach into today's world, how we address those moving forward not only defines us as a nation, as a country, but it defines us individually as Canadians, and particularly for those of us who are not Aboriginal. I mean, a couple of speakers have mentioned today about, the importance, and I'm really struck by that, of, their children being a first generation not under the Indian Act regime in their particular nation. I look forward to the day. I don't think it will happen with obviously, well, my children are already born, but I look forward to the day when their children live in a country that the vestiges of colonialism have been eradicated, that the socioeconomic gaps between non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal Canadians have been eliminated. My hope is that that will be within a generation. It's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of work to get there. This is something that I think, it's personal to this Prime Minister. It's, and I take that in terms of, my job being responsible for treaty negotiations in this country, I take it personally too. I can't think of anything that I've done in government that's more important than what I'm doing today. Folks that know me know that I love the job that I have. I can't think of another job I would rather do. It's also one of the hardest jobs in the government of Canada. It's not an easy job, and I get that we've got to do a lot better, and I think we're trying to find a path forward where we will do a lot better. The Prime Minister in December set out some of the elements of the agenda that he wants to move forward on in terms of how to get to this notion of a renewed nation-to-nation relationship. He talked about that we have to move forward on implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, but we have to do that in partnership with Indigenous communities, provinces, territories, and other partners. Then we also have to look at implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and again, we have to do that through dialogue. And we need to engage and implement a national reconciliation framework. And that last part is important in, I think, our context, and that really does go to some extent to talking about the policy frameworks around Section 35. And I'm well aware that our current policies, whether it's the interim comprehensive land claim policy, the inherent right policy, perhaps even to some extent, don't necessarily align with the vision of the government and where it is that I think we're trying to go. And part of what we, I think are kind of caught in a little bit is, there is this interest in having a renewed set of policies around Section 35. The difficulty is in being able to get there in a way in which we do so by developing those new policies together. So our old way of doing business, the old way of we might go out and have a consultation, have a discussion, could even be at a group like this, and then we would go back, we would write a policy, and then we would issue it. I think those days are done. The way in which we're expected to operate now is that we work together to develop policy. And that's going to be challenging. It's always going to be challenging at the federal level because we have a national scope that we have to be aware of, even though we know that policy has to work within regional contexts. So that's a challenge that I think we're going to face. And it's going to take time. It's going to take time if we're going to do it through dialogue, if we're going to do it together. That is going to take time to develop those policies. So what do we do in the interim? And what I've been talking with my folks about at Indigenous Affairs is that we can't do it as if it's business as usual under the current policy frameworks. So we're going to have to be open to the idea that we are going to be putting aside existing policy as we work at tables to find ways to address the vision of reconciliation and self-government that a given First Nation is coming forward with. That we need to spend more time having conversations about the scope of that vision, and then looking at how we go back to Cabinet to get mandates that will work with the vision that is being presented. So it's more of again, kind of a co-development approach where we sit together and work through what it is that we may need to do in order to arrive at an appropriate mandate that would enable a true kind of spirit of working together to arrive at the reconciliation and the vision of self-government that a given First Nation is presenting. And I think that same kind of logic applies to that question about rebuilding nations. I don't think it's for us to say who should come together or not. I think that is completely up to First Nations to decide for themselves. I think my job is to ensure that we don't have policies that are getting in the way of it. So, I heard Jean's words. I understand that's not the intent of the fiscal harmonization policy, and to the extent to which it's causing issues of being able to have nations come together and work at kind of a national government level within those groupings, we'll need to look at that, and we'll have to make adjustments. That's certainly not the intent. And I'll also say that in terms of the fiscal harmonization policy, our hope is that the go forward in terms of that policy, and I don't know how long that policy would be valid anyway, but the go forward around that policy is really the notion of having this advisory forum where we would be able to sit down together to talk about what things we need to be reforming as we move forward on the fiscal matters. And again, the hope is that we would be able to do that together from now on, so that we would have a jointly agreed upon solution about how it is that we want the fiscal relationship to work. want to talk for a couple of minutes quickly just about the importance of modern treaties and self-government. We have a mounting body of evidence that shows the impacts of improving socioeconomic outcomes as a result of entering into modern treaty and self-government. City Howe Institute conducted a study in 2015, and it found that modern treaties increase real income in First Nation communities by 17%. We also have census data that shows that employment levels of self-governing First Nations are consistently higher than those of registered First Nations on reserve. They're still below the Canadian average, and that is an issue. The gap is closing faster, though, with self-governing First Nations than with First Nations on reserve. But I think again suggests that we still have to be mindful that while there are lots of things that we can do through treaty and self-government, it may not be sufficient to close gaps. And we have to think about what additional things we need to be doing in order to achieve real reconciliation. We also had a study conducted late last year by the University of Ottawa that looked at comparing those that are in kind of the First Nation Land Management Act versus under the Comprehensive Land Claim versus self-government. So trying to get a sense of, is it just about having some governance control, or does it really matter if you actually have a modern treaty versus not? And what we found was that for those who are under modern treaties and self-government agreements, the Community Wellbeing Index is increased by 3 to 5 points when compared to those that are under the First Nation Land Management Agreements or the First Nation Financial Management Agreements. We also found that self-government agreements correlates to reducing crowding at the community level, and that the governance powers, the resource access, and economic benefits that come through modern treaties and self-government agreements are key to reducing dependency and positioning Indigenous peoples to be drivers and improving their socioeconomic conditions. So all of that is to say, in short, that we don't do modern treaty and self-government agreements in order to achieve better socioeconomic outcomes. We do them because it's a right. We do them because this is about fixing the past and getting things onto the proper footing of restoring the relationship at that nation-to-nation level. But how we go about doing treaties and self-government is important. And how we go about doing it, it is important to know whether or not we are achieving the things that we want to achieve in terms of closing gaps in socioeconomic outcomes. We don't know exactly what is entailed in the notion of nation-to-nation relationship. I think that's going to be a dialogue that we're going to be having at a national level in the future. We don't know whether it is simply about mutual recognition, mutual respect, mutual benefit, reciprocal, cooperative, collaborative relations, honorable, accountable representation, or if there's more to it than that. But again, I think that the idea is that we're going to do this through dialogue together to understand what do we think nation-to-nation means and what kind of a relationship do we want. I think that we have a lot of work to do, and I'm aware that we have a lot of work to do. One of the things that we have tried to do, and this has been part of the dialogue that's been going on around potential reforms to the BC Treaty process that have been taking place through the tripartite dialogue between the First Nations Summit, ourselves, and the province, is a recognition that self-government isn't one-size-fits-all. Modern treaty isn't one-size-fits-all. This can't be about cookie-cutter approaches. It's not about monolithic, this is the way it is kind of thing. We need to have more flexibility in the tools that we offer. We need to be able to accommodate various forms of self-government. And ultimately, for me, when I think about self-government, I really think about self-government as being about empowering choices. Self-government doesn't mean that a given First Nation has to deliver every single program and service itself, but it means that it has the choice to either do that or to collaborate with another First Nation that perhaps is also in the area and has a similar type of programming. It may mean working through larger bodies like a FNESC or a health authority, or even with a province. And there's examples across the country of First Nations that are doing interesting work in coming up with real, concrete, practical solutions to addressing self-government challenges around program service and delivery by being creative about the approaches around that. And I think from my perspective, we want to enable all of those things. We want to make sure that we don't have policies and approaches that would inhibit anyone from trying out different forms of self-government or trying out different approaches. One of the I guess, elephants in the room is it is difficult when you talk about self-government when you have smaller sized nations. There are questions about, how many folks do you actually need to have in a community to be able to take on running an education system or wanting to be administering a healthcare system. It's not going to be the same for everybody. But I think what's important is that we find a way to do it so that it is empowering choices and that people are in a position to actually make choices within their communities that are going to work for their communities, and that it's not about us trying to dictate what we think those approaches or solutions need to be. I think that, as we work our way through that, one of the things that we are trying to do now is, we are looking at particularly tables where negotiations have been going on for a long time and where there are real impediments, it seems, to getting to an agreement. And I'm trying to press, not the reset button completely, but basically saying, to the extent to which that conversation is bogged down because of our current policy frameworks, we need to kind of put those aside for a minute and have a real dialogue about, well, what is it that we are trying to accomplish? And then let's go and see whether or not Cabinet is going to be willing to give us a mandate to let us go outside of those policy frameworks to get something done that's going to be practical and real. I think we want our approach to be more characterized by working together. We want it to be more open and transparent. That's a little bit about what the fiscal harmonization policy really was about. It wasn't about trying to say, we think this is the perfect way to do things forever. It was about saying, this is how we've been doing things for the last 5 years. We now want to have a dialogue, now that you see the methodologies, about how to fix those methodologies into the future. And I think that's the approach that I'm trying to bring is, I don't sit here and pretend that every approach that we've taken is the right one. It was mentioned earlier by another speaker about, learning and unlearning. Well, so too we have to do the same. We need to unlearn a lot of things in terms of approaches that we've kind of just assumed are the right way to do things because we've been doing them that way, whether it's under the Indian Act or some other regime that we've been administering for 50 years or whatever. So we're going to make mistakes about that. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say ignorant things at times. My hope is that we'll be at least in a place where the relationship will be strong enough that we will be able to learn from each other, and that when we do make those mistakes, you'll point it out to us, you'll give us the correction, you'll look at it as an opportunity for us to learn, and then hopefully, moving forward, we will be able to achieve what I think everybody wants to achieve at the end of the day, which is prosperous, healthy, Indigenous nations that are well-governed and that have effective nation-to-nation relationships with Canada and British Columbia. And that's what we want to get to. And it's going to take a lot of work. It's probably going to take a lot of money. But it's going to define us as a nation. It's going to define us as Canadians. And I can think of nothing more important. Thank you.